Okay, here we're at abdominal trauma now. This is below the hypochondral margins. Although some of the organs in the abdominal cavity still lie up underneath there because they are suppressed under the diaphragm, and it depends on when the patient was breathing. If the patient was breathing in and the diaphragm had been contracted down, those organs may have been exposed and then more liable to injury. So just be aware that even though the injury is around the lower ribs, that if they were breathing in and they had inspired, that the liver, the spleen, the stomach, gallbladder, pancreas may have been exposed to that trauma. As far as our assessment goes, we are looking for the 4 quadrants. Now we look at sometimes breaking the abdominal quadrants up into more than just 4, but for our simple assessment, we're looking at the 4 quadrants. I remember telling you to look, listen, and feel. So we're going to look and see the abdomen to make sure that it's flat, that there is no demarcation, there's no other types of obvious signs of trauma. And after our visual inspection, we're going to try to listen. Now, you may forego the listening portion. It's all up to you. Knowing and listening to gastric sounds will actually help you, but that's up to you. Now, as we move on to the feeling part, I told you there's some light palpation. It's just to identify areas that are injured, and if they are, it could be musculoskeletal, and then we have to differentiate that by using deep palpation. Now, deep palpation uses the 2-handed technique. The bottom hand, which sits on the abdominal wall, is feeling for anything that you're palpating, and you're palpating using the upper hand, the hand that's on top, as it presses through the abdominal areas. Now again, we got the right upper, right lower, left upper, left lower quadrant. Now let's not be remiss, we also have to remember about the posterior aspect, or the retroperitoneal area. And some of our organs, even though they lie within the abdominal cavity, still lie within the retroperitoneal area, such as some organs like potentially the gallbladder, which lies under the liver, and the pancreas, which lies just behind the lower parts of the lower smaller intestines and the stomach. But everything is based on a high index of suspicion. If you see a scaphoid stomach where the stomach is concave, I would suggest that would be a thoracic injury where the diaphragm has been herniated or lacerated, where it allowed the gastric contents to move up. Now, if we have any bleeding in the abdominal areas, again, we'll have Cullen signs, which is around the periumbilical area, and we may have gray turners, which is along the flank area. These may be late signs, so don't really look for those in the initial onset of your evaluation. Now, as you palpate over those areas, that's what's going to be key, is that you palpate lightly and you palpate deeply, and you may palpate more than 4 quadrants. You may take your time over a certain quadrant to really identify and isolate that area. Now, if you think that there is an injury to one of those solid organs, we're going to have profound hypotension. As we know, even the kidney, the liver, the spleen, these organs take a lot of the blood flow. More so the kidney in the retroperitoneal area takes a lot of the primary blood flow right off the aorta. And when it does that, it will tend to bleed quite profusely. And internally, I told you we can have massive hemorrhage loss in the intra-abdominal cavity and in the pelvic girdle. Now let's just remember thinking about those. Now, as far as penetrating trauma and eviscerated organs, where organs are protruding out through the abdominal wall, it's quite easy to have a small puncture, perhaps maybe an ice pick or something slightly bigger, that penetrates through the abdominal wall, through the muscles, subcutaneous vas, omentum, and allows because the abdominal cavities are all under, they're all tightly compacted, so it's a lot of pressure in there. So if you go and penetrate something through there, and as the person expels that instrument or penetrating instrument, it may allow the organ to protrude out. And when the organ protrudes out, we need to be careful with that. And again, the treatment for that is to go ahead and put a wet, moist, sterile occlusive dressing over that site, monitoring for any hemorrhage or blood loss. I remember the Kona injury, that although the object may have been impaled or at one time penetrated through the abdominal cavity, we need to understand that there is quite a large circumference or diameter that penetrating trauma had caused injury to. It also depends on whether or not that thrust and how deep that thrust was, as far as how much pressure and whether there's a twisting motion. They can cause quite some damage into the internal organs. Now, we talked about the solid organs. These are the spleen and liver that can bleed out, as well as the kidney and the retroperitoneal that takes a lot of initial blood flow. We also want to be sure that these other hollow organs, as they are lacerated, penetrated, they may expel some of the gastric contents, either high in acidity, and as they get down into the lower, smaller intestines, they have less acidity. But as they move down to the large bowel, then we have digested waste products ready for excretion. So this can cause profound sepsis. It can lead to peritonitis. Now, peritonitis again was something that causes irritation of the peritoneal lining. This is the visceral and parietal lining of the abdominal wall. If we have this irritation, it may cause just a localized area where you may find just in one region. When it becomes generalized peritonitis, it may become profound throughout the entire all quadrants, and the stomach becomes very rigid. A rigid abdomen is very serious. It is an acute abdomen. Any serious penetrating trauma or blunt wall trauma that you can see gross bleeding and possibly hypotension with is an acute abdomen. And this requires you to take them to the closest trauma facility. Now, as far as our treatment goes, fluids are an IV axis is probably on the higher level of as far as prescribed treatment. But remember, follow our local treatment protocols, maintain blood pressure of what is required, and then permissive hypotension. The reason why, again, I'll just mention it once now here, is that if we start to overload them with fluid, we hemodilute the serum. So even though they have some oxygen carrying capacity with the red blood cell, we hemodilute them. Secondly, we might think that there might be some washing off of already what's going on. We have platelet plugging, we have calling over of secondary clotting factors that actually help us to create fibrin mesh. And so when we end up giving too much fluid, we wash out those platelet plugs and fibrin mesh, and we cause more bleeding that goes on.